The Asian Environment Lecture is an initiative of two environment groups, the programs at NUS, the Bachelors of Environmental Studies and the Masters of Environmental Management, as well as the Asia Pacific Center for Environmental Law, and co-hosted by the Building and Construction Authority and the City Developments Limited. Okay, I'd like to pass a microphone to Professor Tommy Coe to introduce our speaker, Ms Christine Ervin. Please, Professor.
Christine Ervin is an outstanding American and an outstanding global citizen. She's passionate about nature and the environment, and she's a champion of the green economy, and she believes in private-public collaboration to drive the growth of the green economy. She's a thought leader and a spokesperson for market-based strategies for green buildings, clean energy, and climate change. She has served America at various levels, so let me begin at the NGO level. She has been the director of project for both WWF, which has been referred to, and for the Nature Foundation. She has also served the state of Oregon and Missouri. She was the director of the Department of Energy for Oregon and the director of the Budget Policy Office of Missouri. At the federal level, she served in the I should say in the first Clinton administration, because there may be a second Clinton administration. She served in the first Clinton administration as the Assistant Secretary of Energy, and in that position, she oversaw a portfolio of $1 billion, which was invested in clean energy. She was the first president and CEO of the U.S. Green Building Council, and she succeeded in nurturing what was a startup to make it what it is today, a highly reputable and influential coalition of industry leaders, transforming the way buildings are designed, built, and operated in the United States and abroad. During her tenure, the Council launched the LEED Green Building Rating System, and it convenes annually the Green Build Conference and Expo, which I'm told attracts about 25,000 participants. So you've left, Christine, a proud legacy at the Green Building Council. What is Christine's philosophy? Her philosophy is that results trump ideology. She believes that there is no substitute for strong information and market signals to accelerate progress towards a green economy and a more sustainable world. It gives me very great pleasure to invite Christine Ervin to deliver the third Asia Environment Lecture.
Thank you, Professor Coe. It's a real honor to be introduced by you. And it's an honor to be the speaker for this third series. Hello, everyone. I want to give a real thanks, too, to the hosts and the sponsors for this lecture. You have given me a fabulous introduction to Singapore, and now I understand why it is such a hotbed of innovation. So it's terrific to be here. You know, when I was asked to reflect on the evolution and trajectory of the green building market, oddly enough, it took me back to the Clinton administration, the first, when I was assistant secretary. It was 1995, and we were real excited about unveiling a new product out of a research collaboration we had. It was photovoltaic cells that were integrated into ordinary roof shingles. We were excited until we got the weather report for the next day. It was heavy snow, and most of Washington, D.C. was preparing to shut down. We would have canceled the event, but the research team was already in town. And so the next morning, we trudged our way through the snow, into the headquarters building, down into the basement of the conference room, opened the door, and found a room full of eager reporters. This is the photo that appeared in newspapers across the country. And I was told by the Department of Energy that it was the single most successful press conference the department had had until that time. And so this event really had a powerful effect on me. It taught me, first of all, I could survive a press conference and live to talk about it tonight. But it also taught me the power of this kind of technology, solar and other green technologies, to capture the imagination of the public and even hardened reporters that would walk through the snow to get it. And I think that kind of excitement about the green technologies is part of the driver for this exuberant green building market. But I've also learned since then that it's more than technology, and there are several other factors that are perhaps even more important. So this is the itinerary that I have planned for this afternoon. It's covering a lot of ground pretty quickly. One is to review this remarkable story about the green building market, where it came from, how, what was driving it, some of the tensions, what some of the emerging trends are going to be. And then I'm going to speak very quickly about, despite all that success, it's just not enough. And third, I want to move on and then talk about some of the key levers that we need for speed, scale, and synergy. So let's get started. It wasn't that long ago. It was maybe 15 years ago when if you had mentioned green buildings, a lot of people would have thought of something like this. This is a sweet little hut in Findhorn, Scotland. It has a green roof. Well, kind of a green roof. But it's not at all like the kind of high-performance green buildings that we know today. And when you think about it, it's really not that surprising, because 15 years ago, there really was no common understanding of what a green building meant. And there were very few examples to find and very few people working in the area. And today, of course, that has all changed. There's a couple of ways of looking at it. For one thing, let's just look at the numbers. Here's the trajectory of growth in the United States. When we first launched the green building program for new commercial buildings, the first big batch in 2005, it was about 2% of the new commercial office buildings that year. It was worth about $3 billion. And then you could see how quickly it grew to 25, 47, 60, and 130 billion estimated for 2015. In fact, projected to be, for that 1 year, nearly half of the new commercial office buildings. Another way of looking at it is looking at global surveys that are done of executives from every couple of years by a firm called McGraw-Hill, including executives from around the world. And what you can see there in the first column is that about 36% of those executives in the industry in 2009 said that they were going to be involved in green buildings. That jumped to 68% in 2012. And then those executives projected that in 2015, that about 89% were going to be involved in green buildings. And what's really interesting right here is the set of executives that were doing the most were right here in Singapore, more than any other part of the country. 89% said not only that they would be doing green buildings, but that over 60% of their portfolio would be green. And it wasn't just for new office buildings. It was for existing buildings, and it was for high-rise residential. Really remarkable. And then another way to look at the growth of this green building market is to look at the spread of green building councils around the world. Professor Coe spoke of the US Green Building Council, a coalition, a private-public coalition of companies and NGOs and government agencies working together to create and to support that market. Well, now there are almost 70 councils in various stages of formation around the world. And one of the hotbeds is right here in the Asian Pacific. In about 18 countries with thousands of members. I bet there are more members than this now. This was taken from about a year ago, using 15 different kinds of green building rating systems, thousands of buildings registered and certified, thousands of people working on it. In fact, one of the treats for this week was meeting a number of the board members and staff members of the Singapore Green Building Council. If I don't mean to embarrass you, but perhaps anyone involved with the Singapore Green Council, if you could just raise your hand. Very good, yeah, really doing dynamite work, really appreciate it. So that's how far we've come in a few years. People today generally understand that a green building is more than energy. It's also addressing water and indoor air quality and materials and site and landscaping development. In almost every major city around the world, you could find examples of green buildings from offices, hospitals, airport wings, sports arenas, and there are literally millions of people working in the market. And so one of the questions is, okay, that sounds good, but why do we care? What does it mean? There are lots of ways of looking at it, but I love this one. This is a report done in 2005, actually, from a venture capital firm called Nth Power, working with the MIT Fraunhofer group on research. And this is the way they analyzed the market. They basically said, okay, this is a big industry, not just in the United States. Construction is a big industry wherever you go in the world, a big employer. It's an important industry also in terms of the consumption of resources, the contribution to carbon emissions. So it's big, it's important, but is also slower to innovate than most industries for a lot of different reasons. One is that less research and development money goes into it. Another is that it can be more risk adverse. Some of it is due to the kind of fragmented nature of the industry and that a lot of small firms have low profit margins. And the third thing that they looked at was the research. And the researchers said there's a lot of great technologies out there that are better, that are more efficient. We just need to get them adopted if we can overcome market obstacles, especially during a time of recession. And that's why the title of their book is interesting, How to Innovate for Better Buildings, not green buildings, better buildings. And then the subtitle, A Massive Opportunity Disguised as a Meltdown. And they were referring to the recession. And sure enough, when you look at what happened during the recession in the United States, if you look at that bottom blue line that's barely moving, that was the relative growth in the mainstream construction industry. And look at where the money was going. That's the growth curve in green buildings. In fact, during the recession, market analysts were saying, if you aren't building green to compete in this tough market, you've got an obsolescent product. So that was a really, really important change. So that's one way to look at the emergence of the U.S. Green Building Council and the green building market around the world, is from a market failure perspective. So what was one of the problems? One of it was a fragmented industry. So when you approach a green building, you want to do it from an integrated perspective, looking at water and energy and materials and so forth, and that involves often many different kinds of professions. But there wasn't a common meeting place for that kind of dialogue and collaboration to occur. So one innovative thing that I cannot take any credit for, because the founders created this in 1993, was to create that umbrella on neutral ground where those different parties could come together and collaborate, not only in the membership, but also represented on the board of directors. Another problem, no common definition of green buildings. So the first order of business was to define it, and it became the LEED green building system. Not only to provide kind of an eco-label for buildings, but also to differentiate leadership in the market, and as a way of certifying whether or not a building really met the requirements that were set out. Here's another problem, lack of trained professionals. So we created a LEED accredited program to differentiate the individuals and also to help the industry work with people that knew how to do integrated design. And I must say that we never forecast that it would get this big. And it was really helpful to us because it did give us a really sustainable revenue flow too, I should say. That was a figure from last year. I'm sure there's well over 200,000 people, and I bet there are a few LAPs in this room. Are there any? Maybe not. Oh, there, okay, all right. And then here's the other problem. So we had a council, we had some passionate members, we had a LEED rating system ready to go, but how do you jumpstart the market? This is how, with leaders, then and now, private and public leaders. Even in our LEED steering committee, the two co-chairs, one was from an environmental NGO, the Natural Resources Defense Council, paired with a Fortune 500 company. For leading one of our LEED committees, it was a respected international realtor, real estate development firm. a whole range of different states and cities and the US Navy. But the single most important factor in jumpstarting this market was when the Federal General Services Administration announced on the night that we launched LEED, the administrator stood up and said, our agency, the largest property manager in America, is going to adopt LEED. And not only adopt LEED for its new buildings, but at the second highest level. I can't overestimate or exaggerate the tidal wave of interest that that caused and credibility. Contractors who wanted to do business with the federal government, they had to find out what was going on here. And for the taxpayer as well, they were investing in higher performance building, a better use of taxpayer dollars. So that was another important part as well. But it's one thing to, well, I'll mention this briefly, and then we can talk about it later if you'd like to in the Q's and A's. There were a number of things that we learned or success factors with the LEED rating tool in itself. For example, we didn't try to be too ambitious to start. We started with a smaller new construction market so we could build on success. We didn't have a pass or fail system. We had different levels, tiers of recognition, just like the green mark system here. The certified level that would be easy enough, I should say. It would be attractive enough to the mainstream market to invite them to participate, but the platinum level that would keep the real innovators engaged. So that was a smart thing. Again, something that I can't take any credit for. Tools from a simple checklist that a team could use to explain sustainability to their clients, and then giving a lot of flexibility to the design team, especially in the early years, more optional credits than requirements, because they had to make it work for them. And this is the theory that we were after and that most other rating systems here and around the world are going for. Market transformation. It looks a lot like a diffusion curve. That big yellow blob in the middle is the mainstream market, using tried and true, typical practices. And on the left, you find codes and regulations with maybe 5% of the market not even meeting code. Well, what LEED was after, what Greenmark is after, and others are the other 25%. The 20% green leaders, and then the 5% bleeding edge, as we would call them, the real risk takers here. And the theory would be, as you would imagine, is that once the leaders start putting into place these practices, getting experience, bringing the cost down, it becomes more appealing to the mainstream market. And then if we're lucky, the lower levels of achievement get built into codes, into requirements, and the whole curve starts shifting to the right. And that's exactly what has happened. And I lost my place. 1 second here. It's one thing to jumpstart a trend and to have these various tools, and all of that was good. But to really make it go mainstream, you've got to have a strong value proposition. That's what really makes it mainstream. And so from the very beginning and up until now, everyone wanted to know what the business case was for green buildings. How do you make that? And so the latest compendium is put out through the World Green Building Council, and I recommend it, because it really takes the best data points and proof points and puts them together and talks about, well, what are the real costs of building green? How does it affect operating costs? What does it do to the asset value? How does it reduce risk? And so that's a really, really good example of how that has gone mainstream. But it's interesting, too, to see how the motivations are changing. In 2008, if you were to ask these various executives or building teams, what's the single most important driver? It would be, it's the right thing to do. Well, that is wonderful. But in 2012, look how that changed. And the top 4 reasons are all business market reasons. They vary a little bit from one part of the region of the world to the other. And then the right thing to do is up there, but it's the fifth reason. Some things don't change, and this is so frustrating. All the way from the beginning, there were always this gap between what some in the industry would say a green building is exorbitant, and we can never pay for it. Some just recently are saying it will cost 30% more, whereas all the proof points and a lot of people working on teams didn't have extra budgets. you could make it work. But the average is somewhere between 1% and 4%, with a payback within a few years. So that one is annoying but persistent. There are a number of challenges that any group will experience, and I'll just hit a couple of them, and that is, as you're looking at this market transformation, how often and how much do you raise the bar? Because if you raise it too much, too fast, you lose the market. And if you don't raise it enough, then you lose the innovators that really want to do more. Another is the certification. Certification is so important for credibility. I mean, you just don't go to a future employer and say, I took the equivalent of a master's degree. No, you've got to have earned it. You've got to have a certificate for it, a diploma for it, and that's what we need for buildings. So you've got to have it rigorous, but you don't want to make it onerous for the teams doing it. And existing buildings, much easier to do green for a new building from the get-go. But how do you engage that huge existing market that we need to do? And then selected trends, a couple of these I'm going to talk about in a few minutes. But this is really exciting to see, I think. As we have this experience in this relatively short period of time, we're going from buildings that are doing less bad to net good. We're going from one-time certification events to ongoing performance of the building and benchmarking that against peers. We're going from individual buildings to whole portfolios of buildings, or to communities and neighborhood districts and the campuses. We're going from a technology focus to more of a people focus. From products to transparent disclosure of ingredients in this product supply chain, a big change. And then green is getting defined more and more in richer colors. For example, green being resilient also in this time of climate change. How do you make buildings more resilient to rising levels of sea or to more and more storm events? That's part of it now. Or how do you bring in biophilia, the human reaction to nature, into these buildings? All exciting trends. So it's all great, right? But is it sufficient for the challenges? Part 2. Is it sufficient for the trends that we see in population and urbanization, consumption, all of these challenges that are accelerating, they are scaling, and they're becoming increasingly interrelated in positive feedback loops? And you know, here's a trend, here's a shape that we're all familiar with. These are carbon trajectories. These are different paths that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has put together depending on the energy mix. So we're familiar with that. But this group called the Great Acceleration says, you know, that's not the only one that's showing that same shape. If you look at any number of socio and economic issues, many of them, and many Earth system trends, it's looking the same way. Starting with about the 50s, you started seeing that increased trajectory. So what's happening is that more and more science is being applied to taking the individual problems and challenges and then rolling them up to the big picture. One of the common ones that you're probably familiar with is the ecological footprint. You know, how many Earths does it take to support humanity? Well, sometime around 1970, we passed one planet Earth. Recently, we came to 1.5 planets, and then, as they call it, business as usual, Earth Overshoot Day, June 28th, 2030. That's without any significant changes. But it's a way of capturing what the human species is doing in terms of consumption of resources. Or another science-based project is looking at, and this was published in Nature journal, is defining safe operating space for humanity when you look at the 9 big Earth systems, trying to define where we are in those systems. Here's one final way of looking at the nature of our challenges, and this is from the McKinsey Global Group. Have any of you seen this? It's looking at the question of how much do we need to improve our carbon productivity if we are going to, given these trends in GDP and consumption, if we are going to keep our carbon concentrations within a reasonable level. And what they said defining carbon productivity as how many dollars can we get out of 1 unit of carbon. They said, we've got to increase this tenfold. Well, that's pretty sobering. And then you say, well, over what period of time? Then they compared it to the 120 years of the Industrial Revolution and the change in labor productivity over that time. And what they said was we've got to boost carbon productivity tenfold in 1/3 the time of the Industrial Revolution. So, you know, this brief little snapshot, what that tells me is that over the next 5 to 10 years, we really, really need to focus, laser-like focus, on the levers that are most powerful in accelerating the kind of progress that we need. And for me, the levers that we need for speed and scale and synergy in our solutions, leveraging the power of limits, of markets, and people. So, chapter 3. Let's get on with that. Well, what do I mean by leveraging the power of limits? Well, as usual, Albert Einstein put it best. Once we accept our limits, we can go beyond them. So much meaning in those 9 simple words. You know, when you think about it in our lives, we always use constraints, household budgets, calories, consequences if you go beyond them. In many of our disciplines, we're used to optimizing within constraints. But for the longest time, and until just recently, our whole economic and legal systems did not recognize the limits of our ecosystems. The good news, and what Einstein is getting at here, is now that we've recognized those limits, now that our science is beginning to define those limits, we can use that and harness it to generate innovation. And that's what's happening. So what does that look like in the world of green buildings? Just a couple of examples. One of my favorites is in my hometown of Portland, Oregon. It's a medical complex run by the Oregon Health Sciences University, the first platinum hospital in the world. It's a great building, uses a lot of neat technologies, like chilled beams, pretty unusual in that part of the country. Recycles all of its water and uses it internally. Lots of daylighting, obviously. But the innovation that I loved was the very beginning design goal. And this was about 7 years ago, is when the design or the construction firm and the building owner sat down and said, we want this building to be 60% more energy efficient than a conventional building, and they use much more energy than many others. And we want it for 10% less than the market cost. Well, they used that to select the engineering team, and they got their 60%. And what the team all said in the write-ups and the analyses afterwards, if we hadn't had that big, hairy, audacious goal, the BHAG, do you use that here? It wouldn't have driven us and led us to this creative use of different strategies. That was the power of leveraging limits. Well, this is the same kind of mindset we see right here with the BCA Zero Energy Research Academy that I got to tour the other day. What a treat. Wonderful, wonderful building. Zero energy being, as you know, producing as much energy as it needs. And to do that, you start with a very energy efficient building. And here was a retrofit, even harder. So they did that and took advantage of natural ventilation, took advantage of daylighting instead of active lighting, and supplemented, and they got the result. In fact, we just found out that it's producing a little bit more energy than a net. Fantastic. But 2 other reasons why I love this building, though, is because it really demonstrates what we're learning today, and that is that deep retrofits are much more effective and powerful and cost-effective than the so-called affordable retrofits over time. And the second thing is a test bed for strategies and technologies that will help Singapore reach its BHAG of 80% of all of the buildings green by 2030. And I have no doubt that you are going to be able to do that because of this kind of leadership. Leadership here, a number of other places that are creating a real demand for zero energy buildings. In fact, the whole state of California is going to require all homes, all new homes, to be zero energy in 2020. And all new commercial buildings of a certain size by 2030. It's this kind of leadership that's driving it. Now, maybe the ultimate definition of using limits to drive innovation is this, the Living Building Challenge. Have any of you heard of this? Okay, a few of you. And what this is about is really defining the end goal of sustainability. Not increments of improvement, but absolutes. Not even net neutral, which is fabulous, but net positive. So for example, in energy, the most recent update is, this was created about 6 years ago, 105% net energy is required, including some energy storage. And you find similar requirements, no optional credits, 20 requirements to be a living building. It must be entirely water independent. You have to contribute an equivalent amount of the space that you use for the building in habitat, certified habitat that will be dedicated forever, avoiding lists of toxic chemicals. So obviously, and you have to operate it for a full year to prove that you're really fulfilling what you said you would. So, you know, this is not for the faint of heart, but there are about 300 buildings around the world that are competing for this. Now, they're smart because it is hard to do, and so you can get certified in each one of the requirements as incremental steps, but there are about a dozen buildings that have met all of those requirements. And the largest one to date is the Bullitt Center, a multi-tenant building in downtown Seattle. And what's interesting about that, you could see a number of the features right here. The top hat there is obviously, as you would guess, for photovoltaics, but it's also to catch all of the rainwater that Seattle gets and to funnel it down into big underground cisterns to make it entirely water independent. Things like the health of the occupants, you can see what they call the irresistible stairway, with daylighting to draw people in so they will use the stairs instead of the elevators. But if you do use the elevators, well, they're regenerative elevators, so they create some of their own energy. That's the PV roof, and what they learned after 2 years is that it's producing 60% more energy than they need. So the owner, Dennis Hayes, by the way, founder of Earth Day, said we wouldn't have used quite so many PV bundles had we known this. But they're learning for all of us. FSC certified wood timbers, beautiful, 90% of the space with operable daylight windows. They avoided 308 toxic chemicals, so they did a lot of research to search through the supply chain to find those chemicals. And as you can imagine, just like the ZEV Research Academy here in Singapore, it's heavily used for research and education, lots of tours. We heard at your facility in Singapore that, 28,000 people have gone through touring the facility in the last 6 or 7 years. So that's what this building will be doing as well. So that's limits. What's the next one? Markets. Professor Ko referred to me really believing strongly in market signals, and that is true. I'm so pragmatic. And so, you know, usually at about this time, I would tell an economist joke. I get a number of them from my husband, and if you want to hear one or two in the Q's and A's, that's fine. But I'll spare you that right now. And I'll just say that generally they involve some extreme assumption, like this one often used in physics and sometimes economics. Assume a spherical cow of uniform density. Well, what I would suggest is for sustainability, this assumption is just as absurd. Observe prices and information signals that support a sustainable circular economy. Absurd because it doesn't bear any semblance to reality. When I think back at the Department of Energy, that wonderful job that I had in the Clinton administration, we ran hundreds of programs in energy efficiency, renewable energy, research, development, commercialization. But you know what? A lot of those were really designed to overcome a perverse market ecosystem that penalized them, even though they presented real net benefits to the public into the future. So I think getting the market signals would work really well. Many of you have probably taken principles of economics, and you will recall then that the so-called invisible hand of the marketplace works to efficiently allocate scarce resources when consumers are faced with complete price and information signals to guide their choices. And without those complete signals, then you get the invisible foot, which wreaks havoc in the marketplace. Consumers don't have the information or price signals that they need. I jumped ahead, but that's okay. So it's that understanding, I think, of the power of those market signals, which is one reason why you may have heard last month, Christine Lagarde with the International Monetary Fund announced it is time to eliminate the billions of dollars of fossil fuel subsidies that we have, level the playing field, and start putting a price on carbon. That's what we need. Now, without that kind of signal, there are experiments going on around the world with cap and trade and with prices. And in the United States, you may be shocked to know that we don't have a federal policy on pricing carbon. I'm being a little facetious. But you know what's encouraging is about 2 years ago, there were 150 corporations that were on their own putting a price on carbon for their own internal decisions. And that included Microsoft and Disney. This last year, 450 corporations. And the same survey found that 500 more are going to be doing it in the next year or two. So we're lurching toward better prices, but how much more could we do if we moved on to it quickly? Now here's an interesting question. What would happen if companies faced the full cost of the externalities associated with environmental resources? Well, a firm called TrueCost has actually looked at this, working with data sets from the 1,600 largest corporations in the world. And if you look at this graph, you'll see at the 100%, that means 100% of profit would be at risk if companies face the full cost of those natural resources. And as you can see, with these 600 on average, on aggregate, all profits would be depleted. They would be operating in the red. Two good things about this, if you could say that, is that there may be a trend towards it going down, and more companies are beginning to internalize this so that they know for their own decisions. One other way of looking at this is, if firms face this gradually over a period of time, not abruptly, think of the source of innovation that that would present. Now, there's lots of information signals, but let me just focus on one that I'm most excited about, aside from energy performance labels, which are so important. One example, Hong Kong is requiring that their beam system be presented to owners at the time of sale. That's really nice, because it leads to so many innovative things. If they experience what we did in the Pacific Northwest, you find then for residential real estate listings, consumers can sort then and look for energy efficient homes or for green certified homes. And now realtors are wanting to get accredited in green buildings so that they can differentiate themselves in the market. But the thing that I want to focus on for just a minute is investors are beginning to pay a lot of attention to the performance of buildings. Why is it? Because they see that they're going to minimize their risk from investing in higher performance buildings and optimize their returns. Now, they don't usually invest in single buildings. They invest in whole portfolios of buildings, holding companies and trusts. And so this group called GRESB has emerged in the last 5 years to kind of package all of these buildings together into a portfolio. I have to say goodbye, Professor Coe. Thank you so much. Packaging all this information together for investors. How many? 51. But they hold $6.1 trillion worth in assets. And there's about 707 corporations that are providing a whole range of sustainability metrics and making it available to investors. And so now with this transparency and more information, we're beginning to see trends. Like if you look from the bottom left quartile up to the top, we can see that these businesses, the performance of their buildings is beginning to improve over time. And you could start analyzing the geographic spread. And on this one, it shows the leader of the pack is Australia and New Zealand in terms of the overall portfolios. And then North America, Asia, and Europe are packed pretty closely together. So encouraging trends, they're so exciting, but how much more could happen if we sped this up? And then finally, let me turn to the third lever, and that's people. And maybe this is the most important. You know, when I referred to that World Green Building Council, the business case for green building, well, one of the chapters that got a lot of attention was the one focusing on people. So much so that they followed up about 2 years ago with a report focusing on things like, again, taking the best data points and research out there and saying, how do buildings affect health and well-being? How do they affect productivity? How do they affect recruitment and retention? So just one or two examples. Would it surprise you to learn that many facility managers, half of the complaints that they get are because the building's too hot or it's too cold? No, me neither. But it is good to know from research how that affects staff morale and how that affects measurably productivity so that it becomes a priority for fixing. Or another statistic from this is that fresh air, good quality air, and fresh air ventilation has been studied quite a bit. And in aggregate, the research is showing that with good quality air, fresh air, it boosts productivity from 8 to 11%. That's an outstanding percentage. The book is also very digestible, 55 pages or so, something like that. Also gives really practical guidance and says, look, we know that there are trade-offs between operable windows and providing natural views and so forth. But that's exactly why the trend now is to work more with occupants. We heard about it this week in a couple of cases. You know, either the designer is directly working with the occupants in the design of the building, or certainly after the building is open, having briefing sessions with the staff and the occupants saying, this is what we're trying to do with these features. Help us make it better. Help us let you perform well as the building perform well. And it's a really, really encouraging trend. And not only that, for the high performance buildings, you better involve people because human behavior has a way of undermining the best and coolest of technologies if you don't take that into account. Well, one of the trends that is really neat is the biophilic trend. And that is a wonderful area that is being informed by neurosciences and medicine to study how does the human brain, how do humans have this innate attraction to nature, whether it's trees and nature, vegetation, whether it's water, whether it's the shapes of nature. This is what biophilia is about. And of course, I don't need to tell you, Singapore really gets this, right? The garden city, or the city in a garden. 50% of the land here dedicated to private and public garden space. Such a smart strategy, and CDL's treehouse literally won a world record in the largest vertical garden. And thereby also conveying the fact that you can cut a lot of air conditioning needs using that. And what's great in this field too is that sets off competition and other players that are beginning to do this, like this One Central Plaza in Sydney, and a building in Portland. This old federal building was an energy hog, and it was transformed into this beautiful building, and now vegetation is growing up the sides, bringing greenery to downtown Portland. Those are big examples, but there are small-scale examples too that you're familiar with. The firm Terrapin does a lot of work in biophilia. They call it biophilic interventions, or acupuncture to relieve urban stress. I like that. And then at the mega scale, the world's tallest building now just opened, the Shanghai Tower. And it's so colossal that it really goes beyond human scale and reference. So it's really important that this double shell on the outside allows every several floors light and greenery in their gardens and atria, and more human-scaled public places every several floors. By the way, that really interesting, highly engineered shape was designed to withstand typhoons. And what happened with this is that it reduced the whole weight of the building by about 26%, and they saved about $60 million in construction costs with it as well. This also reminds me of the South Beach development that we toured the other day. Incredible, also using atriums every several floors, and that great canopy that is in the shape of a wave creating its own microclimate. It's the power of biophilia. And then at the very largest scale, it's whole cities, right? And that's the whole urbanization trends, where in 1950, 30% of the world lived in cities. And we passed that mark just a couple of years ago to 50%. And now the projection in 2050 is 68, 70% will live in cities. And what happens in those cities is going to go a long way to determine not only the quality of life and vitality of those urban areas, most of which are going up in Asia, of course, and some in Africa, but also affect world systems everywhere. So how we design those cities and expanded urban spaces to be resilient and green and sustainable and designed for people will make a big difference. And that's why projects like the Chinese-Singapore Tianjin project are so important, not only for a community of 350,000 people, but to serve as a living laboratory for the hundreds of places like this that are going to be developing in the years ahead, or similar to the Songdo, South Korea project too. These are living laboratories for learning how to do this. Well, I've covered a lot of ground, and you may have gathered that I really love to talk about green buildings and creating the built environment. And I think it's because the built environment just lies at the heart of so many of the challenges that we face, from urbanization to climate change. But the other reason why I'm bullish on this market is because it touches people where they live and work. It's tangible. They translate the theory of sustainability into something meaningful and valuable in people's lives. And that's a good thing, because I do hope you agree with me that the trajectory that we're on, we do need to accelerate and scale it and get more synergistic about it. And that's why that sharp focus on the levers that make a difference are so important. You know, whether it be big goals to use those limits to drive innovation, or getting the right, injecting the market with the right signals so that consumers and companies and governments can make wise choices. Or three, building everything around people and the quality of their lives. I've often been drawn to thinking about another lever that really enables all the others. And it's really about values, individual values, public values in general. Because when you think about diffusion of technologies and strategies or overcoming political opposition, it's really a social process, isn't it? And sometimes tipping points can occur pretty quickly where the public starts demanding a certain thing. And that's one reason why I'm often drawn to stories from astronauts about how their whole perspective changed when they went into space. A great example, if you read through some of these quotes, is when you're on Earth, you look at the sky and it's boundless, it's limitless. How on earth can man affect the atmosphere? And then they got into space and they see this thin, waving, fragile atmosphere, all that separates our planet from that dark void of space. Changed their whole perspective. I ran across a documentary earlier in the year that really focused on that moment when we first saw what is called the blue marble now. And in fact, let me just read you a couple of quotes. Here's one from a viewer that turned out to produce this documentary. In 1968, Apollo 8 went to the moon. They didn't land, but they did circle the moon. I was watching it on television, and at a certain point, one of the astronauts casually said, "We're going to turn the camera around now," pointed out the window and take a look at the Earth. So casual, and he did. That was the first time I had ever seen the planet hanging in space like that, and it was profound. Or the astronauts themselves said, it was a shock. You know, the focus had been on the moon. We're going to the stars, to the planets, and suddenly we look back at ourselves. We went to discover the moon, but our new self-awareness may well have turned out to be the most important reason that we went. And sure enough, that image was one of the factors that created that tidal wave of the environmental movement arising everywhere, so many places, in the 60s and 70s. Well, I think we're on the cusp of a sea change now with public attitudes. And so many of us here, whether it's in academia or the business sector, nonprofits, the government agencies, we're working in this charge of grading the built environments for so many reasons, but wouldn't it be interesting if we discovered years from now that the single most important effect of this work was to create that sea change in public values for sustainability? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Ervin. I don't really know how to follow that except to say it was really, really fascinating, inspirational. You took us through so many different facets of life, science, architecture, engineering, economics, all the way up to space and to human values. This really was a truly fascinating talk. Coming from somebody who studies natural systems and evolution for a living, the diversity of life, natural systems, I find the presentation that you gave and the attention to detail and the innovation that you've given us this presentation about to be really mind-boggling. It has really changed my perception of the urban life, so thank you very much. I'd like to open the floor for questions. Professor Victor Savage will moderate, and Professor Savage, thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, I guess you've been entertained by someone who has both the breadth and the depth of the subject matter, and someone who's obviously got both policy issues, being involved in government, as well as someone who is passionate about green issues. So I think she's got different dimensions. So are there any questions that you would like to pose to her? To Christine?
Boy, I got up easy.
No, in Singapore, there's a warming up process. Oh. It takes a bit of time before they get warmed up. But I looked at several things, and I guess maybe I can start with a few things. I guess one of the issues that faces us today, I mean, urban areas cover 1% of land area. They occupy, 52% of global population, but they consume 65, 70, or 80% of resources. So what's the equation there between a totally artificial environment? Cities are totally artificial environments, and we are talking about trying to naturalize cities like natural ecosystems, and obviously the impact, as you rightly pointed out, about consumption of this has an impact beyond the city. I mean, as you say, the ecological footprint is great. Singapore has a great ecological footprint. We're a small city, 5.5 million, 740 maybe square kilometers. But we import 90% of chilled pork from Australia, 60% of frozen pork from Brazil, 90% of tomatoes from the Cameron Highlands alone. So it's not about just the city's ecosystem that we are only talking about, but it's the impact of which city dwellers, and their consumption habits have these tremendous impacts on ecosystems around the world. And I think if the biggest impact, obviously, is Anne Colbert's great book, The Sixth Extinction, which tells us something quite serious in the fact that, we've had 5 major mass extinctions in the last 500,000 years, and now we are in the 6th extinction, that is going to have a tremendous impact. And it's partly because, as urban dwellers, we are consuming so much. So we can maybe fix, in some ways, the buildings and reduce perhaps carbon dioxide, but can we fix actually the nature of our consumption habits, our energy habits, our eating habits, etc.?
You know, that's one reason why I am so passionate about those levers that make a big difference and about the whole values question. Because in the end, it does get to values. But making transparent the impact of our decisions is so important. We don't see those impacts. And so I think some of the early steps that we're taking to a circular economy do really help get at that. Without those signals, without knowing the supply chain effects of importing and exporting like that, we've developed a global system of consumption that would be far different if we had defined it in more of a boundary, if it was more transparent. So we've got a lot of adjusting to do. You're exactly right. I think the only thing that encourages me about that is that cities have the potential to be more efficient than many other places if we do it right. You know, for example, in New York City, most people don't own a car. They don't need one. You know, so there are those possibilities, and when you look at the Internet of Things and you look at big data, Songdo was, one of the things that appealed to me was that they have this pneumatic trash collection system. It takes the trash from your home and automatically conveys it to a central processing facility. I personally like that a whole lot. And you know, you can't do that in a retrofit easily, but if you designed it from the beginning with that in mind, and with a fuller appreciation of the cost and the impacts of those resources, we could get a lot better. But in the end, it's values. You're right.
Well,
I know that doesn't go very far in addressing what you're saying. It's a huge challenge. And that's why those cities that are being developed, they are such important test beds. We're not good enough at talking about the failures that we have, case studies of what didn't work. And we need a lot of those. One of my favorite buildings just did an ex-post analysis of this is what we did right and this is what we did wrong. Well, that's great so that people can learn from that. So.
anybody got something to say to that? I mean, you're right to some extent with values, because I think when you compare, for example, the environmental habits of the Japanese, for example, you've got 26 million people in Tokyo, and you've got a fantastically clean city. Not because the government is cleaning the city, as Gaimin says, you know, in Singapore we have clean cities because the government is spending millions of dollars cleaning the cities. Not because Singaporeans are, by nature, you know, persons who don't throw litter or don't. But in Japan it is so. I mean, it's an amazing example of the idea of civic responsibility that has created an amazing city. I mean, you know, and I say, to say what you say, it is possible. I mean, if there's that tremendous sense of public responsibility and civic responsibility, people can actually do things for the cities.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's where the sense of urgency comes in too. And that's why I think it's so important to not drive ourselves into depression, which I actually did a few years ago. When you start looking at all the data, you think, and then without getting political, then when you look at the views of some of our congressional members in the United States, and then you snap out of it and you say, okay, use that frustration and drive, you know, some ambition with it. So it's developing, it's using that data where we are and developing a sense of urgency that I don't think we have. I don't think we have. It's how do we accelerate the way that we make decisions? One interesting tool that's being developed at a couple of universities are decision-making models that are used to bring in various stakeholders and to physically be able to see and plot out the consequences of different land use decisions, for example. Because these are complex things, and if there are ways to make it visually, you know, comprehensible, that might accelerate the kinds of decisions that we need. So we've just got to develop more of a sense of urgency.
Anybody from the floor? Yep, please. Can you use the microphone? Just state your name and know.
My name's Libby. I'm a researcher from MIT. I just arrived yesterday, actually, and I'm really grateful to attend. I especially appreciated that you ended on the question of values, and my question is about basically the question of continuing to rely on market-based solutions. I'd like to hear more of your thoughts about this and how market-based solutions can address economic inequities, and environmental justice questions. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. You did mention, the question of carbon subsidies and how that might be a route, but I'm currently studying the history of capitalism and how it's tied up with racism and issues around patriarchy, and how this also connects deeply to our dislocation and distance from ecological ties. So I'm really interested in your ideas about market-based solutions or alternatives to market-based solutions. Thank you again.
Yes, thank you. One of my favorite experiences it was 15 years ago or so, I was part of a task force for a city looking at some changes, including congestion fees, which Singapore pioneered for the world. And there was a group of representatives then that worked over a couple of months, and we developed a number of really, I think, progressive, smart solutions, including a congestion fee. And the very last day, someone raised the issue of equity, that it would be regressive and it would penalize lower income. And the director who had brought this task force together said, that's not an issue that this group should deal with, that's one for the legislators. And that was an aha moment for me, because I realized that's the reason why we don't use a lot of market-based solutions, for equity reasons, when in fact, if our task force had been tasked with developing recommendations that address equity, we would have tailored our recommendations, and we would have said, for example, maybe with that congestion fee, we would have earmarked a portion of it to offset the costs for lower income. So I think sometimes that argument is used as an excuse for not getting the prices right, when there are creative ways of addressing the equity impacts of it, and that's what we ought to be looking for. Does that help a little bit? Okay, thank you.
But I think that's an interesting point. Do you think that in a capitalistic system, is that going to be a very kind of sound system of creating environmental sustainability? There's a lot of critics that deal with capitalism. And I guess the recent book by Piketty, the French economist, it's quite clear that, his conclusion is that capitalism increases and enhances inequality in society. And he doesn't see how, with a capitalistic economy, you're going to have disclosure in terms of equality.
I should turn the mic over to my economist husband and just come up if you want to interject here, okay? But, I think what you might say is that it's really funny in the States in particular, people juxtapose government with markets, when in fact one of the primary roles of government is to set the rules for the marketplace. So it's really forfeiting a prime government responsibility when you don't set the rules in such a way that it would take care of that growing inequity. And obviously we have not done that. And that income disparity is a serious issue in our country for sure. But I think government has a proper role to address that in setting the rules. Is that what you'd say? Okay.
Markets are social institutions.
Markets are social institutions, said Professor Ervin.
Oh, I guess that's one way of looking at it. But I think you can say governments take care of inequality, but in Singapore we have a pretty strong government, and I think there's very strong inequality in Singapore. If you look at the Gini coefficient in Singapore, so it's not. I can't buy that very well because if you follow that argument, then we shouldn't have actually very much inequality. But there is obviously growing inequality, and both the 2011 and 2015 election mantras were very much along those lines. So there is an issue here, I think, with the way the Catholic system, obviously we can tweak it in different ways, but it is there.
Well, Well, without in any way getting involved in local politics, I would just say generically that whether or not a government accepts that responsibility is a separate question.
Yeah. Okay.
I thought you were going to ask me to tell an economist joke, so I'm.
Anybody else that has a burning question to ask? Yep, there are two. So we'll start with one and then we'll get to George Ofori.
Hi, I'm Eugene from the Sharing Economy Association. I have a question on the sharing economy and its impact on the built environment, especially hotels. What if a green building is one that's not even built in the first place? So I'd like to
What
hear
is
your
the?
thoughts.
I didn't get the last part of that question.
Can you repeat that again?
Okay, so what is the impact of the sharing economy on the built environment and hotels? And
Hotels?
What economy you say?
sharing economy?
Sharing.
Airbnb.
Sharing economy.
Yes.
On
So
what?
Yep. So what if a green building is one that's not even built in the first place? So you're sharing spaces rather than building new spaces.
Oh.
Yeah, I'm just not an expert in that, but certainly, I'm sure, to the extent that that is occurring, and it is, you're right, that is going to, and is already beginning to change the whole business model for certain products. And so it's interesting that some car companies, for example, are getting in the service industry, and that's certainly one of the trends that you see in sustainability as well, turning from products per se to services. And so that may be one impact and perhaps a very positive one from a sharing economy. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Yeah.
Okay, George, the floor is yours.
Ms. Ervin, well, thank you very much for the lecture. I have two questions.
Yes.
The first question is this. Do you think we are being bold enough and ambitious enough when we take only one pillar out of the three or sometimes four pillars of sustainability, the environment, the economy, and society, and also some other institutional pillar, and we focus on the environment, and we say green building? Do we need something a bit more ambitious than just green, which is only the environment? My first question. Second question, you mentioned the legislators in the United States, and I get very worried. You say you can forget about it, but I can't, because I'm very worried that I've been told that the current situation in the U.S. is likely to continue for a very long time with a group of people who do not believe that there is even something called climate change continuing to be in charge of the Congress for many, many decades, I've been told. So don't we have to worry, because the U.S. actually is expected to be a leader and perhaps should lead towards change instead of leading towards sending us back into the, well, not even the Stone Age, but beyond there. Thank you.
Did you hear a big, deep sigh here? Thank goodness the American public is at least beginning, a majority of them are beginning to counter those small numbers that you were talking about. And hopefully, we're talking about the effect of money in the election system having a really strong effect. Having said that, hopefully the public majority views are going to start prevailing. And that's what gives me hope. It is unfortunate, too, because as you referred to, some members of Congress who are not accepting the science on this, that party used to be a champion of science. And, so I hope they get back to those roots. So on behalf of the United States of America, I apologize. For the first question in terms of is green enough, well, the Living Building Challenge that I talked about, one or two of their requirements have to do with equity and with community. And that is also influencing LEED and other systems like that. So for example, there's a LEED for neighborhood development, and there's a portion of that that has to do then with community linkages, and it gets at equity as well. So I think it is moving in that direction. It's not the whole piece, but it is certainly a piece and a big improvement, because We've looked for so long at the stovepipe issues. In fact, that's what brought me to the field of green buildings. Energy efficiency, renewable energy is hugely important. But when we ran into some political issues in those programs years ago, I realized at that time, it's changed a lot, that there was a pretty narrow constituency, and that's because most people, even environmental groups, didn't connect clean energy with air quality or with public health, with quality of life. And those are things that people care about. And so it made me really, really interested in putting more of the pieces together so that we take a more integrated look. I think that integration is just going to get bigger and bigger and bigger.
I come from a developing country, and for us, it makes sense to look at the broad picture instead of focusing on a narrow pipe.
Yes.
Thank you.
I want to ask you about material utilization, resource utilization. When we see...
Material utilization?
Yeah.
And resource utilization,
yeah.
Okay.
When we see a green building, for example, the building that you showed me, I could see a lot of wood flooring being used. So we are using forest, although there is, you say that 60% of energy was like the building in fact was getting back 60% more energy. So when will resource and energy be interlinked together in green buildings? Because for me, I am an architect, I don't feel that using wood or certain materials which after certain time there'll be 0% of wood left in the world. So I feel that materials and energy, those two things needs to be interlinked. And when will it happen in green buildings?
I think that one of the things that we're evolving to is getting more life cycle assessment data on these different materials that will help us make those choices. In fact, there was a project just announced about a week or two ago. The Healthy Building Coalition teamed up with Google and there are two other parties that are making transparent all the life cycle impacts associated with about 100 of the most commonly used materials in construction. That's a big step forward. And I think that's a beautiful thing about the information signal and transparency is that once you start disclosing information like that, it can lead to changes. And so they're making that available. This is another, actually I'm getting excited about this, is that in order to get some speed to what we're doing, you'll find, for example, Elon Musk with the Tesla. He certainly knew that they could not quickly enough develop the infrastructure to support that electric car. So what did he do? He made the intellectual property available and open, because everyone working with that together, they're going to get there much faster. And so this whole enterprise with the life cycle assessment of materials, which would involve energy as well, that's going to accelerate the learning that we do in sharing IP.
Decimated as a result of the use of wood in buildings. Well, you could always use forests, reusable forest resources. You have a lot of forest plantation wood. And I guess two outstanding examples of this is both IKEA. IKEA doesn't use any wood that is not based on plantation forests.
What is that?
IKEA.
Oh, okay.
And so does Faber pencils from Germany. They also don't use any kind of natural woods, only wood that comes from plantation forests. So that's one way of getting around that worry that you say.
Wood was just an example that I gave. There are many such examples.
Yeah. I get your point, but also, when you talk about that building in Taiwan, part of this idea of putting high-rise is partly, national pride. Everybody was trying to build a higher building.
Is this wastage factor been priced in? Because imagine that everybody is using solar panels now, photovoltaics, and 10 years or 15 years down the line, these are going to be disposed. And is there a space for this so-called disposal? And the disposal cost is going to be very high as well. And if you are disposing the panels, it's going to affect the environment again. So does it become a vicious cycle that hits us again? We enjoy the 10 years or 15 years of a good environment, but what about those guys left behind 15 years for the wastage? When we go to throw them, it's going to affect them or not? So that's the first question. And the second one, actually, I'm just opening, and maybe probably more towards to the council who are actually, or to the university or whoever is involved in the green environment in Singapore. We are rated one of the highest ranking in the region, like you said. But unfortunately, we are having zero subsidies for all this green environment which we're trying to encourage. Australia, Europe, they're having very high subsidies, right? Yeah. For residential building that we're trying to build, we all have to come out of our own without any subsidies. And a lot of our clients actually participated because of values, as you say. I want to be green, right? So even there's no subsidies. But I think with the council, with the strong council, all the professors inside here, I'm not sure, maybe they can speak to the government to consider, right, really pushing it. And, you know, even 20%, I think will really jack up a lot of people trying to participate in the photovoltaic installations in their, in fact, we have just actually signed up under one for another building, all on our own costs, without any subsidies. So maybe the council can actually consider pushing a bit to encourage Singapore to actually come up to move faster in this area.
Well, if I understood you correctly, I think, again, that is where the life cycle assessment really comes in looking, I'm on the board for a Green Electronics Council as well, and the impact of it, the end of life is huge. And so that's the kind of holistic perspective that we need to take, is what happens to the materials from the beginning to the end, and we just need to keep making progress. That's all I can say.
Just want to hear your perspective from United States side. Often when we look at a high-rise building, it's got to do with the building envelope, and it's got to do with the inner skin, and it's got to do with the outer skin to provide shading, to provide environmental control. Now, you know, whatever we clad in a building, there's always a 600, there's always a 800, and I just want to know, when in America, do the architects who design the external facade goes through very fine gross floor area calculation? You know, it's like, oh, you cannot have that 200, you cannot have that 300. I just want to understand, does the architects in America, if you do a green building, do you have to do very fine calculation, or is this a bonus given in order to go green? In Singapore context, when you buy a land, you're only given a certain ratio to build, and that's a quantum you build. Now, for most developers, the quantums are sellable quantum. Now, they will not give that sellable quantum for you to do green. They would say, look, I need to sell that square feet to realize my return. My question is, in America, do the building council or the green council encourage the government to go beyond that and say, hey, look, that 600, we're going to give it to you for green. And it's going to be free gross on the built quantum. That means you waived it from the built quantum.
And sometimes it's graduated depending on what level of greenness it is. One of the ones that I remember is when we wrote a little booklet called Making the Big Business Case on Green Buildings. I happened to sit next to a real estate developer who was not at all interested in green. And I was testing out these various business case reasons with him, and he was being very polite but ho-hum. And then I said, how about expedited permitting? And he said, now that little lady would get my attention. And so, you know, zoning, expedited permitting, zoning changes, waiving fees, giving more of a FAR allowance, all of those things are market tools to encourage what we want. So yeah, quite a few jurisdictions are doing that.
Especially in Asia, we have more and more larger cities. So in your view, larger cities more efficient or a cluster of smaller cities? Thank you.
Larger versus smaller cities?
Yep.
You know, you're right, they warm up. You ask me tougher and tougher, I think I need to get out of here soon. Haze, small or larger? No.
Someone over here wants to ask.
Well, let me just say that, you know, I think that's why I put a big emphasis on people. You know, we can design the greenest, smartest, sustainable city, and if it's not working for people and there's not a good business plan for occupants and quality of life, then it, you know, it's not serving the purpose. And so whether or not that's a growing and expanding area and letting it grow and green organically versus something that is built on new ground, I think if you put people at the heart of it and a business operating plan that this is going to work for people, attract people, sustain them, give them a good quality of life, then it may sort itself out. But that's all I got.
Yeah, you have a question?
I'm Sheila, and I just wanted to know your thoughts about this. Like, we've been talking about green buildings, so I really have two questions. One is more on the building level. Like, regarding the future of green buildings then, like a zero energy building with a short lifespan would contribute minor to society, of course, but then if you consider their, how do you say, alternative use, when they're, because like somehow buildings are not immune to obsolescence, right? So I'm sure what will happen 50 years from now with these buildings if we don't know, are there some initiatives in the US, like we try to consider like what will be the alternative uses of a certain building when its function, original function is already, how to say, like obsolete. And the second one is this more on the urban level. It's something like we do focus on green buildings, and a lot are doing, I mean, successful in it now. All countries are doing it. However, if we focus only on individual buildings and new construction, somehow the pace of combating carbon neutral goals would be more slower. But what if we focus also on adaptive reuse of the existing buildings, trying to turn it into robust urban regeneration projects, then maybe it will also contribute to sustainable cities. So those are just like, I wanted to know if there are some initiatives done in America about it, because I'm sure in a lot of Asian cities, there are really more, there's still challenges in green retrofitting, in green adaptive reuse. There's still a lot of like how you encourage the owners, of course, in infusing these new technologies with the existing ones.
For example, when we have an aging population, some of the newer homes are being built so that you can change the configuration for aging in place. Or being used for an alternative use. One of the big themes in America that may be quite different here, but it's also looking at the greenest building is an existing building. There's a lot of embodied energy in the materials. So try to make the most of that existing building before you tear it down and build new. So that's kind of the logic. Now, when you need to build vertically and you have limited land space, that could change the dynamics a little bit.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, this will close our session for this evening. I'd like to thank you all very much for coming and attending. Next year will be a very special event for us in the AEL. It will be our 4th, but also we'll be celebrating the 20th anniversary of the Asian Pacific Center for Environmental Law, the 15th anniversary for the Masters of Environmental Management, and the 5th anniversary for the Bachelors of Environmental Studies. So we look forward to seeing you next year. We do have a reception outside, so please feel free to come and join us and ask more questions to Christine, if she's willing. But I have a feeling that David is going to be willing to answer some questions, we hope, as well. So thanks again for coming, and we'll see you outside.